love story, an Oscar-winning actress, and a country music star who overcame the odds. But behind the red carpets and duets, things were falling apart. Court documents now reveal Nicole filed for divorce after 19 years, with sources saying she fought to save the marriage. His first public performance post-split showed no wedding ring, no love song for Nicole, and altered lyrics that hinted at rewritten history. The golden couple image is shattered, and Nicole's side is finally emerging. We take a closer look at what made them so admired, and what led to the end of one of Hollywood's most iconic love stories. Nicole, the shy dreamer turned Hollywood royalty. Nicole Mary Kidman was born in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1967, to Australian parents who were temporarily abroad. Her father, Andy Kidman, was a clinical psychologist and biochemist, and her mother, Janelle, was a nurse and educator. When she was still a child, the family returned to Sydney, where she grew up in a household steeped in both discipline and ambition. Unlike the bright, poised figure she later became, young Nicole was painfully shy. She would blush so intensely when asked to speak in class that her teachers worried she lacked confidence. Yet, that timidity was paired with a powerful imagination. She sought refuge in performance, first in ballet, then drama classes, and finally in youth theater groups where she could channel the emotions she found hard to express in daily life. By her teens, her talent was undeniable. Australia's film industry at the time was blossoming, and she seized her chance, landing roles in television movies, and eventually was cast in the 1983 cult thriller BMX Bandits. Her porcelain features and height made her stand out, but it was her emotional range that convinced directors she was destined for more. By the late 1980s, Hollywood came calling. It was during this rise that Nicole met Tom Cruise, her first great love and her first great heartbreak. They got married in 1990, becoming one of Hollywood's most photographed couples. For Nicole, the marriage brought prestige, but also pain. Scientology, which is Tom's religion, cast a long shadow over their union. While she rarely speaks in detail about those years, it is well known that when the marriage ended in 2001, she lost not just a husband, but also primary custody of their two adopted children, Isabella and Connor. This wound cut deep. Friends later revealed that Nicole felt stripped of motherhood itself, relegated to the edge of her children's lives. For a woman who longed for a family of her own, the rupture would become one of the defining traumas of her life. It is perhaps no coincidence that when she later met Keith Urban, she was determined to rebuild the dream of home and family she had lost. Keith, the troubled dreamer with a guitar. Keith Lionel Urban was born across the Tasman Sea in Whangarei, New Zealand, the same year as Nicole. His family moved to Queensland, Australia, when he was still young, and it was there that his personality began to take on a restless, rebellious hue that was constantly seeking some form of escape. His father, Bob, owned a convenience store but was also passionate about country music, a genre not exactly mainstream in suburban Australia. He encouraged young Keith to pick up the guitar, and by the age of 6, he was already performing. Country music, with its tales of heartbreak and redemption, offered him both identity and therapy. But while his musical talent was prodigious, his home life was less harmonious. Allegedly, he lived in a family marked by tension and financial struggles, which may have contributed to his lifelong search for stability. In his teens, he performed in talent shows and small bars, cultivating not just his sound, but also his image as the brooding country outsider with a rock star's edge. He soon dropped out of school to pursue music full-time. For Keith, there was no plan B. Music was his only ticket out, but along with the talent came demons. By his 20s, he was already experimenting with alcohol and harmful substances. Fame, when it arrived, didn't steady him. It amped up the chaos. He moved to Nashville in the early 1990s, hungry for recognition, and after years of grinding on the circuit, his breakthrough finally came in 1999 with his self-titled American debut album. Suddenly, Keith was country music's new heartthrob, known for his guitar prowess, tousled hair, and a voice that dripped with longing. However, behind the scenes, the success was laced with self-destruction. By the time he met Nicole in 2005, he had already been in and out of rehab. He lived with the perpetual fear that his addictions might cost him everything he had fought to build. Nicole and Keith seemed, on paper, to come from different worlds, a case of Hollywood prestige versus Nashville grit. What really bound them was the baggage they carried. Nicole bore the scars of a lost family and a marriage that made her wary of control and betrayal. Keith carried the volatility of a man who had known both obscurity and fame, but never quite conquered the urge to sabotage himself. When their paths finally crossed, both were at turning points. Nicole had reemerged from her divorce stronger than ever, winning an Academy Award for The Hours and cementing her reputation as one of the greatest actresses of her generation. Yet she remained emotionally raw, craving stability after a decade of turbulence. Keith, meanwhile, was a star on the rise, carving out his space in the hyper-competitive world of American country music. But the trappings of fame, endless touring, temptation, and the demands of an industry that prizes image as much as sound were pushing him to the brink. He needed someone who could anchor him, who could help him believe in something beyond the stage lights. Looking back, it is impossible not to see the foreshadowing. Her desire for control and stability was always going to clash with Keith's restless, addictive personality. Their union carried the promise of healing. Perhaps she could rebuild the family she'd lost, and he could find redemption in her steadiness, but it also carried the seeds of future conflict. For Nicole, the idea of being with another celebrity carried its own risks. Her marriage to Tom Cruise had taught her how brutal the public gaze could be, but with Keith, she saw vulnerability, even fragility, and it called to her protective instincts. For him, she was both a muse and a mirror, someone whose discipline and success highlighted his own instability, but whose love offered him the chance to become the man he always wanted to be. Their early lives had carved them into complex, wounded individuals. When they finally collided in 2005, it felt like destiny, but in truth, it was more like volatile chemistry, crossing paths in fairy tale romance. When Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban finally crossed paths in 2005, it was publicized as a story straight out of Hollywood fantasy. Two Australians, both global stars, both born the same year, both hardened by past struggles, colliding at the exact moment their lives seemed poised for renewal. The red carpets and glossy magazines painted their meeting as fate. But beneath the surface, the relationship was less about destiny and more about two wounded people clinging to the hope of salvation. The first spark came at the Day USA Gala in Los Angeles in January 2005, a celebration of Australians working in Hollywood. Nicole was fresh in the storm of her divorce with Tom Cruise, but by then she had rebuilt her career and stood tall as an Oscar-winning actress. Keith, on the other hand, was a rising Nashville star whose records were starting to cross into mainstream pop appeal. When they were introduced, she later admitted she didn't think he was interested. He was polite but reserved, and though they exchanged numbers, he didn't call her for months. She confessed years later that his initial lack of approach nearly derailed the love story before it began, but when he finally reached out, something clicked. Their romance moved quickly once it began. By May, they were photographed together, and by the end of the year, she was describing him in interviews as the man who had swept her off her feet. For her, who had lived through the suffocating surveillance of her marriage to Tom, he represented freedom. He was passionate, raw, and unpolished in every way that Tom Cruise wasn't. For Keith, she represented legitimacy, elegance, and the kind of stabilizing force he had never known. By November, he was walking red carpets with Nicole, not just as her date, but as her partner. Their chemistry was obvious, and the press fell hard for the pair. Australia's golden children had found each other in America. In June 2006, just over a year after they began dating, they married in a lavish ceremony at the Cardinal Soretti Memorial Chapel on Sydney's Manly Peninsula. She wore a Balenciaga gown with dramatic veil, while he, with his trademark long hair, looked every bit the romantic troubadour. The guest list glittered with Hollywood royalty and country music stars, but the real story was the intimacy of the event. She reportedly walked into the church by candlelight, holding back tears, while he serenaded her during the reception. For fans, it was a picture-perfect ending to both of their troubled pasts. Nicole, the woman who had endured the controlling grasp of her previous love, had found a man who appeared to adore her unconditionally. Keith, meanwhile, had found redemption in the arms of one of the world's most respected actresses. Unfortunately, unlike fairy tales, reality was less perfect. The first cracks, Just 4 months into the wedding, Keith checked himself into rehab for alcohol abuse. It was a devastating blow to their newlywed bliss. Nicole had barely finished writing her thank you cards when she was thrust into a crisis. The tabloids pounced, suggesting she had married a time bomb. For him, the relapse was humiliating. He had vowed that her love would be enough to keep him steady, but his old habits resurfaced quickly. Nicole, ever protective of her private life, chose loyalty over embarrassment. She stood by him, visiting him in rehab and refusing to give the press the satisfaction of seeing her falter. In later interviews, he credited her with saving his life during that period, but insiders saw something more complicated. She had been denied the chance to save her marriage with Tom, so now she was throwing herself into the role of healer and protector with Keith. She believed in second chances, and in him, that loyalty would define much of their marriage, for better and for worse. Despite the shaky start, the couple spent the following years crafting their image as one of Hollywood's rare, enduring romances. She continued to take on major film roles, balancing blockbusters like Australia with critically acclaimed performances in films like Rabbit Hole. Meanwhile, he solidified his status as one of country music's biggest stars, touring relentlessly and winning accolades, including multiple Grammy Awards. Publicly, they were affectionate. She once described him as the person who brought her back to life. Keith frequently thanked her at award shows, sometimes with tears in his eyes. Behind the curated image, there was tension. His career meant long stretches on the road, while she often filmed abroad. They tried to make it work, even implementing rules like never spending more than a few weeks apart, but insiders reported that their schedules frequently clashed. Nicole, deeply scarred by her separation from Isabella and Connor Cruz, clung to the idea of family. When she and Keith welcomed their first daughter, Sunday Rose, in 2008, followed by Faith Margaret in 2010, she poured herself into motherhood. He adored his children, but struggled with the balance between fatherhood and the restless life of a touring musician. Later on, they successfully sold themselves as the antidote to Hollywood cynicism. Interviewers lauded them as proof that real love could survive fame. Photos of the family at the airport, her clutching the girls while he trailed behind with luggage, reinforced the image of a tight-knit unit. Yet, beneath the surface, their bond had weakened. His ongoing battle with sobriety was a constant problem. Her need for stability sometimes translated into control, and friends hinted that the couple's differences ran deeper than either admitted. Still, they pushed forward, determined to preserve the fairy tale. Their early years together had been marked by the quick intensity of falling in love and immediately getting married in a short time, while weathering the crisis almost immediately. That intensity meant they never truly slowed down to confront the cracks forming in their foundation. For nearly 2 decades, they kept up the facade, a reformed bad boy and his patient savior. What no one knew then was that the same whirlwind energy that carried them into love would eventually propel them into heartbreak. The fairy tale was always fragile and built as much on hope and performance as it was on reality. But the pressure was building. Love under pressure. By the time Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban reached their first decade of marriage, they had already survived more turbulence than most couples could endure in a lifetime. Rehab only months after the wedding, long separations due to career demands, and the balancing act of raising 2 daughters in the public eye all created a constant undercurrent of pressure, and yet for years, they remained a symbol of resilience. By the mid-2010s, rumors of tension began to surface more frequently. There were whispers of arguments over schedules, over Keith's nightlife, and even over Nicole's intensity. The couple consistently denied the speculation, often presenting united fronts in interviews. Nicole would often insist they've never been stronger, while Keith would echo the sentiment, describing Nicole as his rock. Yet cracks have a way of showing, no matter how carefully hidden. Friends close to the couple described her as someone who had grown increasingly weary of carrying the emotional weight of his struggles. While she admired his artistry, she worried about his mental balance. Keith, meanwhile, sometimes reacted whenever he was cast as the one needing rescue. He allegedly wanted to be her equal, not her project. What kept them together for so long was the same thing that pulled them apart, and that was their contradiction. Nicole loved his vulnerability, but feared it. He loved her strength, but felt overshadowed by it. Their marriage was a constant negotiation between saving and resisting, between passion and exhaustion. All the while, the public narrative remained stubbornly intact that they were the love story that had beaten the odds. Few knew how much effort it took to maintain that illusion, how much of their private energy was spent propping up the facade. The pressure to live up to their image was enormous. They weren't just husband and wife. They were the embodiment of hope for fans who wanted to believe that love could survive addiction, distance, and fame. Every photo, every public gesture became part of the mythology. But mythology, as history often proves, can be both inspiring and crushing. Nicole and Keith had become prisoners of their own fairy tale. Raising their daughters also showed their differences. Nicole, mindful of the lessons from her own fractured family experience, emphasized routine, structure, and shielding her children from the chaos of fame. Keith leaned toward leniency, playing the role of the fun parent. While their daughters adored both parents, insiders whispered that Nicole allegedly felt undermined sometimes, while he sometimes felt criticized for not being serious enough. These weren't the explosive fights tabloids dream of. They were quieter divisions, the kind that wear down trust and intimacy over time. The tabloid murmurs and eventually divorce. As the 2020s dawned, tabloids began to speculate about cracks in the marriage. Stories surfaced about arguments, about time spent apart, about whispers of Keith's old demons. Both Nicole and Keith dismissed the rumors, often appearing hand in hand soon after a story broke. Nicole would insist in interviews, "We've never been stronger," her calm tone disarming skeptics. But behind those denials, there was truth to the rumors. Keith continued to battle sobriety. While there is no evidence that he spiraled as dramatically as in the past, insiders suggested that her fear of relapse never fully left her. She remained vigilant, sometimes to the point of tension. To Keith, it could feel suffocating to be monitored and doubted, even when he was doing everything right. Nicole, for her part, grew weary of always being the anchor. She adored him, but she longed for balance, for a marriage in which she wasn't constantly bracing for the next storm. Perhaps the most revealing sign of their unraveling was the difference between their private and public selves. Privately, they were drifting, clashing, circling around unresolved issues. Publicly, they doubled down on the fairy tale. Their red carpet appearances became increasingly important, as though they were staging performances not for the cameras but for themselves, reminding each other in the world of love story they had once believed in. At events, Keith would grip Nicole's hand tightly, often kissing her shoulder, whispering in her ear. She would smile composed, but observers noticed that her smile seemed more rehearsed than spontaneous. The affection looked real but strained, like actors reciting lines they had long since memorized. Every marriage carries unspoken resentments, but in their case, those resentments grew louder with each passing year. Nicole allegedly resented his dependence on her strength, his need for her to be both wife and savior. He resented her control, ability to manage not just herself but him, their children, and their image with military precision. Friends close to the couple described their dynamic as one of constant negotiation. He craved freedom while she craved security. He wanted passion while she wanted peace. Neither was wrong, but their needs were rarely in sync. By 2023 and 2024, the whispers became louder. Anonymous sources in entertainment magazines hinted that they were living separate lives, that they were together but apart. Paparazzi photos began to support the theory as she started attending events solo. Meanwhile, he was spotted on tour without his wedding ring, as both of them avoided questions about each other in interviews. Still, the couple resisted the narrative of collapse. Nicole often spoke about how marriage required a lot of work, an admission that seemed modest but also revealing. He would insist that she was his everything, even as his words began to sound like rehearsals in old script rather than spontaneous declarations. Still, ultimately, every unraveling has a tipping point, and theirs came in the summer of 2025. By then, the cracks had widened into fissures. She was spending more and more time with her daughters, retreating into family and away from the circus of speculation. Meanwhile, he threw himself into music, touring harder, pouring his emotions into performances that sometimes bordered on confessional. Those closest to them say the decision to separate wasn't explosive. There was no single scandal, No final argument. Instead, it was a slow acknowledgement that they were no longer sustaining each other. Nicole, heartbroken but resolute, realized she could no longer be both partner and caretaker. Keith, weary of the weight of Nicole's expectations, chose to step away. When she finally filed for divorce in late September 2025, citing irreconcilable differences, the world gasped. But for those who had been watching closely, the end felt inevitable. For nearly 20 years, these two had built one of Hollywood's most admired stories, a tale of redemption, resilience, and lasting love. The words on the legal documents were brief, just irreconcilable differences, yet they carried the weight of a story far more complex.